Lately, I've been reading some cases where either buckshot or large lead balls fired via handguns fail to penetrate more than a couple inches into a bear. This first case involved multiple people firing .36 caliber Colt Model 1851 revolvers into a full-size grizzly. After passing through the hide, these rounds failed to penetrate more than an inch into the bear's flesh. These bullets were round balls made out of soft lead, and were of similar size and weight to quadruple-aught buckshot. However, they weren't particularly powerful, having less energy than many .380 rounds. What actually killed this grizzly was 2 rounds fired from a Colt Army Model 1860 in .44 caliber. These round balls were actually .454 in diameter and have power comparable to a 9mm. The obvious question is, what's going on? It's clear that the .36 caliber rounds deposited all of their energy into the bear, yet this energy was not converted into lethal damage. All of the energy appears to have been exhausted in a bit of hide, muscle, and fat. In my opinion, this severe lack of penetration is being caused by a combination of the following: round projectile shape, soft bullet material, and the elasticity of the skin and tissue helping to absorb/dissipate the energy. With the same amount of energy, very round bullets have less penetration than very flat-nosed bullets do. A bullet that's a round ball has poor sectional density and wastes more of its energy on stretching tissue out of its path. This problem is increased further when the bullet is made out of soft lead and deforms easily. To demonstrate this problem with deformation, I want to show you a picture of triple-aught unplated buckshot pellets that were shot into water jugs with a .410 revolver. As a side note, generally when you fire a 12-gauge round of double-aught buckshot into water or ballistics gel, the pellets are mostly flattened on only one side. But with a .410 loaded with triple-aught buck, they get flattened on 2 sides like a coin is. The .410 triple-aught is not staggered, they're in a straight line so they impact each other. This leads to an initial flattening as the gun is fired, on top of further flattening that happens on impact with the target. In comparison, 12-gauge double-aught is staggered, so for the most part, they will only have one side that's really significantly flattened when they impact the target. Back to the main point, a much more recent incident was mentioned in a forum post. A brown bear was shot in the chest with 2 blasts of double-aught buckshot from a distance of only 15 feet away, yet these pellets had only penetrated 2 or 2.5 inches into the bear. Likewise, a friend of Grizzly Adams had shot a bear multiple times with a handgun. Again, the round handgun bullets had little penetration and were found in the fat of the sides of the bear. This next case involved a black bear that was shot with a slug first at 20 yards and then with 2 rounds of double-aught as it ran away. The slug is what killed it, as the buckshot failed to make it through the thick layer of fat. As always, you can pause this video to read the text much more thoroughly. I just want to give you a brief summary of such incidents to prevent my videos from dragging on too long. This effect is not limited to bears either. It happens with lions, tigers, leopards as well, for example. This quote involves 2 tigers shot with 8-pellet triple-aught buck. The first tiger was shot in the chest with 6 pellets, and these were flattened out on the muscles, failing to reach the heart. 2 pellets hit the throat, ruptured the trachea and some of the blood vessels. These were what eventually killed the tiger 7.5 hours after it was shot. The second tiger was hit in the chest with 7 triple-aught buck pellets that flattened out and also failed to reach the heart. Similarly, the killing injury was a single pellet that severed the jugular vein. In case you were wondering, both of these tigers were of the man-eating Royal Bengal variety. We also have a couple of leopards to talk about as well. The first leopard was shot once in the head and once in the chest with 3-inch, 10-pellet, triple-aught Remington buckshot. Most of these 20 pellets were found inside the leopard. While the rounds did stun the leopard, they did not kill it. Shot to the head did crack and dent the skull, but none of the pellets penetrated into the brain. With the chest shot, the pellets flattened out against the muscles of the chest and did not get anywhere near to penetrating into the chest cavity itself. The second leopard was shot with Federal triple-aught copper-plated 3-inch buckshot. The first shot was to the head, and it resulted in a cracked skull and blinding the leopard in one eye. However, all of the pellets flattened out and none of them actually reached the brain. The second shot was to the chest, and most of the pellets flattened out against the chest muscles. Only 3 of these pellets actually made it into the heart, and these were what killed the leopard. Famed hunter Peter Capstick mentioned a leopard that was shot at 40 yards with 2 rounds of SSG buckshot. When the leopard was skinned, only 3 pellets were actually found in it, and one of those pellets could be easily just squeezed out of the skin. In this book, Capstick says SSG is roughly equivalent to double-aught buck, which is wrong. He also says it's only .25 caliber, which is closer to the truth. From what I've seen, they are supposed to be roughly .27 caliber. SSG is actually very close to number 2 buckshot, and it's called SSG because it's intended to be used for special small game, not lions. We also have an incident mentioned by Dennis D. Lyell. This involved a lion being shot at multiple times from a distance of 30 yards with SSG buckshot. Several of these pellets flattened out against the skull, and just like with the leopard, none of them did any significant damage. Likewise, a charging lion was shot in the face with buckshot, and none of the pellets managed to penetrate the skull. It was actually killed with the .308. Yet another leopard was shot twice with American-made double-aught buckshot. Again, the pellets flattened out against the chest muscle and the skull. It was actually killed with a .500 double rifle. You may have noticed that I have been talking about the failures of buckshot, and have not yet mentioned any serious injury or deaths caused by these failures. A mixture of luck and the circumstances involved prevented these cases from ending badly. However, not everyone was so lucky. This next case involved a hunter named Almany going after a leopard with a double-barrel shotgun. When the leopard attacked, Almany fired, landing each of the pellets on the leopard, who was unfazed and severely mauled Almany. Someone intervened and attacked the leopard with a knife, allowing Almany to get away. Another hunter named Theo went after the leopard again after Almany had left for the hospital. Theo was armed with Almany's shotgun and had expected the leopard to be dead by then, but it was still very much alive and attacked Theo. Theo missed the leopard with the first barrel, but hit it squarely with the second. However, this only had the effect of damaging the leopard's leg. Theo was being mauled and was beating the leopard over the head with the barrels of the shotgun when someone else thankfully intervened and killed the leopard. It was never mentioned what size of buckshot was being used here. This is a local hunter, part of a party who went after a man-eating leopard in 2017. He had a Winchester Browning A5 loaded with Winchester copper-plated double-aught 3.5-inch shells. He fired at the leopard's head from a distance of less than 10 feet. 13 pellets lodged against the leopard's skull, and not one of them penetrated into the skull itself. This man was relatively lucky because he was only mauled for a few seconds. The leopard was then promptly shot and killed with a rifle. His stomach was not hurt, by the way. It was just blood from the head wound that I wanted to censor in order to avoid any problems with YouTube. When Robin Hurt decided to go after a leopard, he chose a 12-gauge shotgun loaded with double-aught buck instead of his usual .470 double rifle. When the leopard charged, he shot it in the neck, and since this was at close range like most leopard encounters are, the pellets didn't have the chance to spread out. However, the leopard was unfazed. It knocked Robin down and knocked the shotgun out of his hands. Then it began to maul his arms and legs. Then it abruptly stopped mauling Robin and moved away, as its neck wound was starting to take effect and cause fatigue. This was when Robin's gun bearer came over and quickly finished the leopard with a headshot from Robin's .470. This incident shows a couple of important things. The first being that the neck shot requires less penetration than the head or chest shots, so it can be effective even when your ammunition has fairly low penetration. Second of all, it's all too common to hear someone say that they were mauled by a dangerous animal and that their weapon was knocked out of their hands. Then after the mauling, they don't know where the animal went and they don't know where the gun is. Then they typically have to wipe the blood or scalp out of their eyes and look for their gun on their hands and knees as quietly as possible. I've thought about this for a while, and it may be helpful to have a steel cable attached to a sturdy point on your weapon and then hooked to your belt. That way you will never be far from your weapon, even if it is knocked out of your hands. During real-world bear attacks, it has been proven that bears can tear off holsters and easily shear off the sling swivels from rifles, so it's very important that whatever point you attach the cable to on your gun is very strong, and the reason why it should be a steel cable is because rope can be bitten through and chain would make noise. Obviously, these are just my thoughts, so I don't fully know whether or not this would be practical. The only thing I know for certain is that it'd be a constant reminder that you shouldn't set your rifle down and walk away from it. Back to my main point, we also have a case of a man shooting a man-eating female tiger. Once she was killed, it was discovered that she had 2 old wounds. Both were from buckshot. One shot was in her left shoulder and the other was in her right. If either of these blasts of buckshot had enough penetration, she'd simply be a dead tiger, instead of a wounded tiger turned man-eater. When we are talking about the effectiveness of buckshot, the range involved matters a great deal. Some people, like Sir Alfred Pease, made the habit of using birdshot from a distance of about 3 yards to kill lions as they charged. This is the very definition of tempting fate, in my opinion. You may ask, how can you kill a lion with birdshot if triple-aught buckshot can underpenetrate? Part of the answer is the fact that at very close range, birdshot will impact and act sort of like a single projectile. The other part of the answer is a sort of game of odds. With enough luck and skill, some people can do foolish things and survive to write about it. Others may not. There's a big question though. How likely is it that buckshot will underpenetrate? People will have different answers to this question as experiences will vary, but we can definitely say that the chance of failure dramatically increases when you use small buckshot at longer ranges. First of all, with buckshot in general, the chance is low enough that some people will still hunt and kill black bears easily with double-aught buckshot. We also know that it's still fairly common in Africa to use a shotgun loaded with some kind of buckshot when following after a wounded leopard. Famed hunter Robert Rourke even went as far as saying that shotguns and buckshot are mandatory for following after wounded leopards. There will also be people like professional hunter Russ Broom, who uses a discontinued 10-gauge Mag-10 shotgun loaded with triple-aught buck and 3.5-inch shells. He's a bit of an outlier in this regard. One man has found that with double-aught buck, also known as SG, even at 5 yards, it will not reliably penetrate into the skull of a leopard. He mentions the fact that he's skinned many leopards shot with double-aught, and that more often than not, the pellets would be found lodged against the wall of the skull. He also mentions that leopard skulls are not particularly strong, and that the shape of the skull is contributing to reduced penetration. Bear skulls are also similar in this regard. A sloped skull means that the soft lead pellets encounter more resistance and have reduced chance of penetration. This also applies to tank warfare as well. Extremely angled, thin armor can offer the same protection as thicker armor that is only marginally angled. Likewise, yet another man has found similar results. Buckshot flattens out on the muscle of leopards, and when you use regular slugs, they'll only penetrate about 6 inches. I'm also going to talk about an experiment that Sergeant Bob Brown of the Alaska Department of Public Safety did. He took 3 brown bear skulls that still had the flesh attached and shot them at different ranges. With double-aught buckshot at 50 yards, few if any pellets actually hit the skull. At 25 yards, more pellets hit the skull, but still none penetrated it. At 15 yards, there was more penetration through the flesh, but still the pellets were not making it into the skull. So he concluded roughly within 15 yards, double-aught buckshot will probably be effective. Obviously, though, he doesn't recommend using buckshot because of this low penetration. So this obviously wouldn't just apply to skulls either. The chances of breaking a leg or shoulder bone with soft lead buckshot drop off very dramatically as distance increases. He also found that with 12-gauge slugs that they could penetrate into the skull at least out to 25 yards. In a separate real-world incident, a live bear was shot in the back of the head with 2 Brennecke 20-gauge slugs from a distance of 20 feet. One slug passed through the neck and the other hit the top of the skull, but failed to penetrate it. It did crack the skull and chip off a piece, but that's not nearly good enough. The type of 20-gauge slug that was used was not explicitly mentioned, but it was likely one of the hardened lead slugs that Brennecke is famous for. I would not say that all 20-gauge slugs are ineffective. I would say that we don't know enough details about this incident to make a good conclusion. After all, with a particularly bad shot angle, a 12-gauge slug may also fail to penetrate the skull. As mentioned before, even with triple-aught copper-plated buckshot, there is still a chance of underpenetration. So if you are considering using regular buckshot against dangerous animals like bears or tigers, you have to compare the risks versus rewards in your specific situation. If you are worried about black bears or mountain lions attacking you while you're camping, I would have no hesitation of using regular unplated soft lead buckshot. The reason why this is because the odds of being attacked by such creatures are fairly low, and if you are attacked, the odds of double-aught buckshot failing against black bear or cougar are also pretty low. However, this situation changes entirely if you're playing the odds more often by doing something like frequently help pack out meat in grizzly country or following wounded leopards as part of your job. If you're doing something like this, you really need something better than unplated buckshot. I should also say that with unplated buckshot, the magnum loads may give more pellets, but it's also very common to have a less dense pattern than you would normally have with standard length shells. Some people may want to use 3 or 3.5 inch shells for bear defense, but we have to keep in mind that with double-aught buckshot, the effectiveness at range is very dependent on velocity. A pellet that leaves the barrel at roughly 1,300 feet per second may not penetrate a skull at 15 yards. You may reduce your velocity down to about 1,200 feet per second with a common 3-inch shell, or possibly down to 1,100 feet per second with a 3.5-inch shell. You can see how this could be a problem when I tell you that regular double-aught buck is traveling at roughly 1,175 feet per second at the 15-yard point. Triple-aught buck, on the other hand, retains much more of its penetration and effectiveness as it goes down range. Winchester has a line of copper-plated, high-velocity buckshot that boasts an impressive 1,450 feet per second of velocity regardless of what shell length is used. However, we know that with real-world use on animals, as mentioned before, and from plywood penetration testing at 40 yards, that copper-plated pellets can still deform and flatten. We can also compare nickel-plated double-aught buck to copper-plated double-aught buck. Even when the nickel-plated pellets are at significantly lower velocity, they still have higher penetration than the copper-plated ones. This would make sense because nickel is harder than copper. At 40 yards, the nickel-plated buck was not flattened, only a little scuffed. Likewise, when used on deer, the nickel-plated buck was only a little scuffed, but the lead pellets were 1/3 flattened. We also have some more penetration testing of buckshot in plywood, this time at 5 yards, and we can take away the following conclusions. A very tight pattern leads to more penetration, which is why the flight control double-aught buck went the deepest. Triple-aught unplated buckshot at an advertised velocity of 1,225 feet per second penetrates roughly 1/2 inch more than unplated double-aught buck at 1,325 feet per second. Most of the triple-aught stopped in the third sheet as opposed to most of the double-aught that stopped in the second sheet. However, there is always variability, so individual pellets can go deeper than the rest of the load. At such close range, unplated triple-aught buck has a great amount of deformation. Even though copper-plated triple-aught buck has much less deformation, this didn't result in any great increase of penetration. I also have to mention, if you watch the video of this testing, the person who did this experiment concluded that the double-aught buck has better penetration than the triple-aught buck because of its smaller diameter. This is simply wrong. Larger pellets have more momentum, which means despite their larger diameter, they still have better penetration. Finally, another person mentioned the fact that he hunts feral hogs, and standard lead buckshot wasn't really satisfactory for his needs. He switched to hard cast lead buckshot because it has much less deformation. In my opinion, good buckshot for bear defense is made out of hard cast lead and is loaded into homemade flight control style wads. You can actually buy double-aught tungsten buckshot, as well as rounds loaded with chrome-plated steel ball bearings. However, from real-world use with handgun rounds, we know that hard-cast lead ammunition is more than adequate for bear defense. Federal has flight control wads that stay with the shot longer and result in a much better pattern downrange. However, Federal doesn't sell these wads. So a few clever people have realized that you can make your own version of this. There are videos on YouTube that show you how to do this. You take a wad made for steel shot and cut it in a specific manner. These modified wads have 3 tabs that come out and stabilize the wad and shot during flight. If you make the tabs too small though, it will be unstable in flight and result in poor accuracy. However, there is still the question of what load and velocity is best, and I believe more real-world testing is needed to answer this question. Specifically, we need to know what impact velocity does hardcast double-aught and triple-aught buckshot fail to have enough penetration. Then we can use that information to calculate the effective range of different loads. With regular 2 3/4 inch shells, double-aught buck has only one more pellet than triple-aught buck, a fairly small advantage. However, double-aught gets much more of an advantage as the shell length increases. Recoil and shell length may also be a concern. A powerful 3.5 inch or 3 inch shell may be too much to handle for some people. Also, long shells not only limit the rounds in your magazine, but many shotguns can't use 3.5 inch shells. I want to also say that you can load your magazine with standard 2 3/4 inch shells, but put a powerful, longer shell in the chamber. This way you can enjoy full capacity as well as the benefit of having one magnum round. I mentioned the need for more testing before. There's the obvious question, how would this real-world testing be done though? Fresh brown bear heads, for example, are not easy to get for most people, and it would be obviously quite foolish for someone to hunt living bears with ammunition of unknown effectiveness. If we want to do more than just limited testing, we need to have animals of similar size to bears, and that are much more readily available. In my opinion, cattle would probably be close enough. Bears and tigers are obviously anatomically different than cattle. However, the front of a bear's skull, for example, is not particularly thick or hard to penetrate. The main problem with failing projectiles, whether we're talking about tigers or bears, is that they expand far too much when they impact flesh and bone. If you remember some of the quotes before, some people have attributed the lack of penetration on tigers and leopards to be a result of their muscles being very hard. Muscles obviously aren't physically hard like bone is, but when they are flexed, they have a noticeable amount of resistance. This is why a soft-lead shotgun slug may have only 6 inches of penetration on a particularly muscular animal like a leopard. However, we know that from the rounds that stopped in bear fat, it's not just muscle causing underpenetration. This chart came from a study that tested different weapons on cattle cadaver heads for the purposes of finding humane euthanization methods. I did heavily alter it so it's easier to understand. I find it interesting that the .45 full metal jacket round only had somewhat more penetration than the 30 grain 22 long rifle hollow point. The 223 50 grain VMAX varmint round actually had the same penetration as a 9mm full metal jacket. Of all of these rounds, the soft lead 1 ounce Winchester Super X slug had the best penetration. This isn't really saying that much because such slugs aren't the best for bear defense. I say this because they are made out of soft lead, and even if they impact ballistics shell, for example, they can still fragment. In case you're wondering, these heads were shot from a distance of 3 to 6 meters. At such a close range, the number 4 birdshot actually has pretty good penetration. This is only somewhat related, but this image shows what happens when you shoot a .38 Special full metal jacket into a water buffalo skull. The bullet gets pretty mangled, but still has fairly good penetration. Like with buckshot, a thin layer of copper is not really enough to keep soft lead from deforming when it hits thick bone. As for the .357 Magnum FTX round, it pretty well disintegrated after passing into the skull. This may be lethal at close range with a very straight-on shot. However, I would really question if such a bullet would make it through the skull at longer ranges and if there was more of an angle involved. For those of you who don't know, water buffalo have a very thick frontal plate and require much more penetration to euthanize than regular cattle do. In this experiment, the bone thickness needed to reach the brain ranged from just over 2 inches to 2¼ inches, which is 5.22 centimeters to 5.72 centimeters for those in metric countries. This is significantly more bone than any bear has in front of its brain.